Since roughly 2016 or so, if you've come across media of Ukrainian soldiers, chances are you've encountered a rather basic-looking tan-dominant digital camouflage pattern dubbed simply as MM14. Due to its similar appearance, it is often compared to that of the US Army's ill-fated and controversial universal camouflage pattern. But MM14 is very much its own design, going so far as to become something of a symbol of Ukraine's attempts to not only update and reform its armed forces, but also create a unique identity for any and all who wear the pattern. However, the journey to create it was not a quick nor easy one. Ukraine has had a very long and unique history as it's found itself smack dab in the middle of Europe and Russia, meaning it is often involved in the politics, events, and conflicts of both. This had been the case for many centuries, however for our story we don't have to go back that far, instead just to the early 1990s. With the collapse of the Soviet Union seeming more and more inevitable, many republics were announcing their independence, along with numerous Eastern Bloc countries turning away from communism and Russian influence. However, quite a few of these countries did seem to keep one prevalent influence, that of Soviet-centric military forces. Be it weapons, vehicles, uniforms, equipment, tactics, formations, and so on, numerous former Soviet and Eastern Bloc states kept a lot for years after. Ukraine was no exception. In fact, it was considered to be the largest, most prevalent example of this, as just under 800,000 former Soviet troops stationed in Ukraine, along with all their equipment, vehicles, and so on, essentially became Ukraine's overnight. Now known as the Armed Forces of Ukraine, not a whole lot was done with it over the next 25 or so years when it came to modernizing, upgrading, and giving them a unique identity. Though there were instances in minor changes or reforms in policy, the forces stagnated and continued to use Soviet equipment. In fact, via a 1995 decree by the Ministry of Defense, the Soviet-designed pattern TTSKO, also known as Butan and sometimes VSR-84, officially became the standard issue camouflage. Along with this came numerous other Soviet and Soviet-inspired patterns, such as KLMK, Barvika, and even newer ones like VSR-93, a pattern implemented by Russia after the fall of the USSR. As the years progressed, Ukraine constantly found itself teetering between aligning more closely with the West in the form of the European Union and NATO, and the East in the form of Russia. This in part delayed much advancement when it came to military reforms and camouflage development. However, that changed under Viktor Yushchenko when he held office between 2005 and 2010 as the third president of Ukraine. During his campaign, he had made a point to push for more European integration, joining NATO and creating a more independent Ukraine, so much so that he and others have alluded or believe that his attempted assassination by way of the chemical agent dioxin was related to his stances. One of these manifested in an attempt to alter uniforms and gear to some extent, with a limited camouflaging development endeavor appearing in 2007 with at least one known pattern known as Abatrex. Designed by Andriy Vasilyevich Taranenko, the pattern was labeled as bionic in that it was seen as adaptive to many different terrains. Quite a few versions were experimented within the two primary biomes, forested and steppe, which eventually led to two variants, a green and tan dominant. Though the experiment was deemed successful to some extent, the project never went beyond the testing phase. After Viktor Yushchenko was unable to garner enough support for re-election, Viktor Yanukovych took office. During his 4 years, a number of changes were brought about and effectively resulted in the jump-starting of serious reforms and updates. One of the earliest, as far as camouflage goes, came in 2011 when a digital pattern often referred to simply as Border Area Digital was issued to members of the State Border Guard Service. Seeing colors similar to that of the then standard issue Butan, it was hailed as a step forward to modernization and creating a unique identity to forces. However, a few issues soon arose. The design was said to have been created in the nearby Czech Republic, which was then at some point outsourced to China for manufacturing, which led to it becoming commercially available. As you can see in the side-by-side, different colors were seen. The pattern was then printed in other locations such as Turkey and Ukraine, resulting in differences in the quality of colors and design overall. Due to the widespread availability of it from Alibaba sellers to Japanese airsoft companies, just about anyone could get their hands on it, causing security concerns. In addition, the overall design was somewhat ineffective due to a very noticeable repeating series of stripes. But it should be noted that this was essentially one of the first steps in a much larger endeavor, as made clear by a training exercise called Perspective 2012, which was held from late September into early October of 2012. These exercises had the goal of assessing forces to various extents, as well as improving troop management, specifically managing different unit types, combat training procedures, and communications and relations between the armed forces and the public. As a part of this, numerous new pieces of equipment, gear, and uniforms were also fielded. Various patterns made appearances that were both older and domestic, and some newer and foreign, such as Dubak and Multicam. However, one that seemed to catch many people's eyes was that of ATAC's Arid Urban, AU for short, which drew the most attention. Printed on Gorka-type suits, MK2s to be exact, these, mixed with the other pieces of equipment, were seen as sleek and streamlined while being worn by members of the 95th Airborne Brigade. However, it appeared that they were something of a last-minute addition as they were given to forces by the recently established P1G Tactical, a Kiev-based company specializing in tactical and military equipment. Though it seemed the patterns were being assessed to an extent, it's hard to tell to what capacity as far as concealment capabilities go. After the event, it seems that ATACs was only seen via private purchases. Now, around this time though, a more serious camouflaging endeavor was underway, led by the Ministry of Defense, likely as a more formal part of the same reform efforts. During the exercises, it was announced that 60 sets of a new uniform type had been purchased and tested during the event, which were showcased with placeholder designs of both Multicam and Coyote, with the intention of getting all special operations groups equipped with them by the middle of the following year. This was one of the first steps related to the recently announced Order 181 titled On the Establishment of a Working Group to Develop Military Uniforms. That was to essentially modernize almost all facets of uniforms, gear, and equipment. Helping with these new cuts? Garm, the uniform branch of the Norwegian company NFM, which was planning to produce them within Ukraine. We'll circle back on this shortly. In November of 2012, the Materials Service of the Rear Headquarters of the Armed Forces finally unveiled the pattern they had been working on intended to replace most of the others and become the standard issue. This pattern, a darker green dominant pixelated one, appeared on a uniform almost identical to the ones created by Garm. They were field trialed by a number of forces during select training operations between November of 2012 and roughly June of 2013. The pattern itself doesn't seem to have a specific name, but many have referred to it as a pixelated Flecktarn after the colors, which resemble that of Germany's temperate pattern of the same name. Supposedly, a number of other countries' patterns beyond Germany were also taken into consideration, with one of the most significant being the US Marine Corps' MARPAT designs that had also recently been adopted by nearby Georgia. But one can't help but think that it too was influenced by other ones out there, such as Estonia with their EST-DCU and Canada with its CADPAT when considering colors. Regardless though, this green dominant pixelated Flecktarn was analyzed at the request of the ministry by a number of individuals and entities ranging from engineers, topographic specialists, and military intelligence, to painters, artists, reserve personnel, and commercial companies, one of which was Combat SPN. These analyses unfortunately are not too commonly known, with the exception of Combat SPN's, which was posted to their website at some point. Link can be found in the description if you want to read it in its entirety, but some of the main points were: the pattern was limited in operational capacity in that it would only work in select locations around Ukraine. It seemed to have been influenced in some way by the border guard pattern from a few years prior. The difference in colors between the pixels and the shapes they made up were ineffective from a variety of distances, and that though the design worked a bit better than Bhutan and patterns used at the time, it was still far from the best option. This sentiment seemed to have been mirrored by many, with some speculating that the design originated from abroad, like the digital border, with others even going so far as to joke the design was just a slightly reworked and recolored version of it. By June, two things were clear. The plan to have many special forces equipped was not going to happen, and the green digital was a failure, resulting in them having to go back to the drawing board. However, while all this was happening, a few other things were going on. Then Minister of Defense Pavlo Lebedev, in a green digital uniform, reinforced and talked more about Ukraine's shift from a conscript-based military to a professional one. Older uniform stocks were running low, and the company P1G unveiled it had been working on a new uniform pattern in the hopes it could be used as an official design. In early 2013, the company had been developing a green dominant pattern simply named Frog. Designed by a team of 7, with one being Konstantin Lesnik, 2 versions were eventually seen. The just mentioned green dominant, named Frog Field, sometimes Forest Frog, and Steppe Frog, one that was developed about a year later. Field Frog, a more bright green dominant pattern, was designed to be used in, according to the website, the forest and forest steppe zone of Ukraine, as well as in areas of mixed, humid forests of tropical and equatorial zones. Steppe Frog, a more tan and brown dominant pattern, was designed for use in the steppe zone of Ukraine, as well as in semi-deserts and deserts, savannas, and prairies. The design is rather interesting, and when asked why the pattern wasn't a digital one, which would follow the trends of the time, Lesnik stated, "Pixel colors appeared 10 years ago, and today, in our opinion, have outlived their usefulness. If we focused on fashion, we might really choose digital drawings. Now that quote may have just been brought up to describe Toad, but it could also be
a huge steaming bowl of foreshadowing.
Regardless, the pattern itself has a few names such as frog, toad, and zaba, the Ukrainian name for it meaning, well, frog or toad, all of which are based around the amphibian that was used as inspiration for the patterns. Both variants were commercially produced, the rights to use them eventually being transferred over to Ukraine for use in March of 2014. However, since the patterns were eventually both available commercially, many sets were gifted to various units, specifically Marine forces. This leads us back to the company Combat SPN, which around the same time had developed something of a universal pattern dubbed Predator. Unlike the previous approaches, this pattern saw a mix of tans and greens seen in an attempt to make it effective everywhere in the country. This pattern would evolve a bit between its year of inception and 2016, in which it would be stacked up against other patterns for adoption with sniper units. These adjustments saw its shapes blurred, which did little to increase its concealing capabilities, so it was reworked into a different pattern referred to as Phantom, which would go up against Predator, Solid Coyote, Bhutan, and the MM14 pattern during testing. Though it proved effective in many regards, it ultimately was not chosen. This resulted in the development of Phantom being suspended. However, Predator continued to be used in a limited capacity by select units. Remember how the government had to go back to the drawing board? Well, they did, and though it's hard to say exactly how many different pattern designs they came up with, there were developments. Before they came to fruition, though, another big development occurred in the country in the form of large-scale protests which quickly turned to revolution. Though President Yanukovych initiated quite a few reforms to the military by way of updating materials and shifting it from a conscript to a professional one, many believed he harbored more pro-Russian sentiment. However, it wasn't until late November when he and much of the government switched, practically overnight, their positions of supporting the European Union-Ukraine Association Agreement to one of leaning towards aligning more closely with the Eurasian Economic Union and Russia. This resulted in a series of protests within Kiev, now known as the Euromaidan or Maidan Uprising, after the square where it originated, which quickly grew in frequency and intensity. By late February of 2014, it turned to a full-blown revolution, resulting in Yanukovych's and many other politicians' ousting, along with various other reforms. From there, a chain of events would be put into motion which began with many pro-Russian people and groups protesting and/or rebelling primarily in the eastern portions of the country against the newly installed government and policies. Russia annexing Crimea, citing political unrest and many in its population being ethnically or pro-Russian, and eventually large-scale conflict breaking out between Russian-backed separatist forces and Ukrainian forces within the eastern Donbass region of the country in what is now known as the Russo-Ukrainian War. Being that all this was happening while the armed forces were in a very serious state of flux as far as restructuring and reforms go, they were largely ill-prepared for combat. A mix of regular ground forces, militias, and volunteers fought in the east, but often wore assorted uniforms and camouflages, such as the aforementioned older Soviet or domestically Soviet-inspired patterns, privately obtained or donated surplus such as German Flecktarn, British DPM or DDPM, and Italian Vegetato, and commercially obtained ones like Multicam, Frog, and Predator, among many others. This resulted in a level of disorganization and posed the risk of friendly fire as well as infiltration from hostile forces, making the need to develop a standard issue uniform and camouflage even more vital. Now, going back to the development of the green digital pattern in December, during the midst of the popular unrest, a new pattern was issued to members of the 95th Air Assault Brigade to test out. This pattern, another digital design, appeared almost more transitional in nature as it saw more lighter greens and tan tones compared to the darker forest green colors associated with the previous iteration. Unfortunately, not a whole lot more is known about it, being that come June of 2014, photos surfaced of a third, more tan digital variant, which eventually would become the MM14 camouflage pattern, with it being seen on a much larger scale in October 2014, when it was worn by graduating cadets in Odessa. Now, how the pattern was changed so much that it went from a green to a tan dominant is a bit murky, but with a bit of deductive reasoning, a theory of the design process can be created. Prior tests showcased that Ukraine was broken down into the forested and steppe regions, meaning two patterns may have originally been considered, with the green dominant one appearing first. However, due to negative reactions mixed with time, cost, logistical, and other constraints, a pattern that could work in both was created. With hostilities popping up in the primarily stepped east, the pattern was again reworked to fit the zone where fighting would mostly take place. This tan dominant one fit the bill and seemed more effective in blending the colors and even seemed to work rather well beyond the eastern region. Again, this is just speculation, but whatever the case was, the new pattern was then printed onto a cut very similar to the one designed by the Norwegian company Garm, and was officially presented to the public on August 24, 2016, during the National Day Parade. The name MM14 is short for Maljunok Mask Uvalnes Zaraska 2014 Roku, which translates to Camouflage Pattern of 2014, as that's when it was really finalized and presented for the first time. Again, apologies for the possible mispronunciation. Beyond those names, it's sometimes called M14, Pixel, Ukraine Pixel, and Gunpowder 1. Now, one interesting element of the pattern are the changes encountered between batches and certain fabrics, as slight differences can be seen in the overall shade throughout. Additionally, when seen or captured under certain lighting conditions, the pattern sometimes gives off an almost green appearance. Now, that's it, right? The pattern was created, adopted, and began being issued to forces. That's the end of the story. Well, no, because even though the pattern was unveiled in October 2014, and again in a much larger way in August 2016, it wasn't until 2017 or so did things finally settle down, and the pattern cemented itself as a standard issue camouflage for most of the ground forces. Now, regarding early circulation of the pattern, a few issues came up relating to the uniform's cut and its fabric. Regarding the cut, it relates to an issue that had been plaguing Ukraine for quite a while: the cost and lack of infrastructure to pay for and develop uniforms and equipment. Originally, it had been said NFM was going to build a factory in Ukraine, but when they saw the amount of money Ukraine's budget allowed for, they pulled out of the deal. Ukraine was left with a fully designed concept uniform cut, which was used as a basis for all three versions of the digital design before being issued to forces. Eventually, this initial cut was done away with for a more original one and presented along with many other updates to uniform systems that were closer to NATO standards. Enter the Volunteer Landing Party, the name given to a group of civilian volunteers who, since 2016, had assisted with the advancement and upgrading of all things related to the armed forces. From uniform design to meal preparations, these volunteers worked on nearly every level of government when it came to modernizing troops. Though this had started in 2016, since the early 2010s, civilian and commercial outlets had been actively assisting, supplementing, and working for the government in various ways when it came to the armed forces. One of these groups was called Phoenix Wings, run by Yuri Biryukov, who in November 2015 shared the information he obtained, thanks in part to his position as an advisor to the president, that NFM was suing the Ministry of Defense over the uniform cut, and that was one of the reasons it was changed. Naturally, many media outlets around Ukraine and the region picked up the story. However, the website stopfake.org reached out to NFM Group regarding the situation and received the following response: "We do not confirm the information that NFM filed a lawsuit against the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine. We don't know anything about it." Whether there was behind-the-scenes legal issues or not, another problem came up. In smoke, that is. Fabric used for many of these uniforms, identified with the code APT2701, before 2017 or so, were much more flammable, which caused quite a stir. This was quickly adjusted, seeing the newer fabric being much more flame retardant. While these adjustments were being performed, the camouflage pattern Varan entered the scene. With the Volunteer Landing Party being made up of individuals ranging from everyday people to ones running or owning businesses, there were many things being worked on. Camouflage was one of them. Much like when the Ministry of Defense had contacted individuals and entities with the so-called digital Flecktarn, they too looked to the private sector with these matters. When it came to the new uniform cuts, one of the leading members of the project was Konstantin Lesnik. Remember him from before? Well, he was still the head designer of P1G Tactical, and as such had quite a bit of knowledge with uniforms and camouflage development. In a press conference held in September of 2015, he came out and announced quite a few things. One of the biggest was the creation of the Center for the Development of Logistics of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, essentially a single entity that could oversee and run development of things like uniforms and gear. Up until then, many different departments had been working independently and in tandem with one another, which had caused some communication issues. However, for this story, the most interesting development was a new universal pattern called Varan ZSU. ZSU being the English acronym for Armed Forces of Ukraine, designed by P1G for use as the new camouflage pattern of Ukraine, which had been in the testing phase since July. Now, keep in mind that MM14 was technically revealed in 2014, but not to the public in any big way until 2016. So a lot of stuff happened in between those 2 years. Lesnik went on to say, "We developed a new camouflage pattern. I will explain the problem with the old one, Pixel. When we started, we realized that the Ministry of Defense did not really have the copyright for pixel camouflage. It is not regulated by anything, so the great variety of pixel camouflages on the market, Chinese counterfeits, etc., we, the Ministry of Defense, cannot regulate in their activities, and, unfortunately, we cannot make claims to anyone. Thus, a new camouflage pattern was developed for the uniform of the armed forces, redesigned for the Ukrainian era. Essentially, it boiled down to the issue of copyright and not being able to regulate the pattern, along with the issue of MM14 being a relatively straightforward design, being very reminiscent of others out there, meaning it could easily be reproduced or mistaken for look-alike ones obtained through various means. He went on to say counterfeits, copies, or look-alike patterns could be used to impersonate Ukrainian forces by enemy saboteurs and recon forces. But another thing to look at were the claims that MM14 was just a rework of the border camouflage seen years prior. Though the coloring and sizes of the pixels that make it up are different, the shapes are actually mostly the same. Here's a quick look at the border digital, the green Flecktarn, the 2013 experimental Transitional, and the final MM14. Inspecting it closely, you can see that all four patterns share the same shapes, with differences coming down to scaling, certain ones changing colors, or being somewhat repositioned. A result of this, though, was the stripe design that made the border digital pattern less than optimal mostly faded away. However, if you look hard enough, it can still be seen somewhat. Now, this could all just be coincidence, but essentially, if true, this means another interpretation of what Lesnick meant in regards to copyright is that the design was based on the border pattern that was originally obtained from abroad, meaning that though the pattern had technically changed, it still was not entirely a 100% original design, and thus rights were not assured. Whatever the case, Varan ZSU, usually referred to as just Varan, began being tested by highly mobile units, such as Select Special Forces, as well as the 79th Airborne Brigade, with the plans for field trials to complete by the end of November and the end goal of issuing the pattern to all forces the following year. So what exactly is Varan? Consisting of shades of brown, tan, and green, it is made up of a series of shapes, textures, and designs that take on a three-dimensional appearance that almost looks like scales in certain areas. This makes sense as Varan can be loosely translated as lizard or monitor lizard, one of the world's largest. Now, in regards to the three-dimensional effect, this was intentional as these mesh structures combine with a background, thus causing a dissolution effect. In addition, the specific colors result in a blurring effect, which too helps with concealment. And finally, a little Easter egg of sorts, the pattern's name is embedded into the design, seen sporadically throughout. So, sounds pretty good, right? An end-all, be-all, universal camouflage pattern with the capabilities to work all over Ukraine and, according to the company, much of the world, that also had the rights transferred to the government free of charge. Well, problems started almost immediately, as according to news outlets, it seems the specifications for the uniforms were changed a few times throughout mid-2015. Soon after, a number of summer weight uniforms were made. However, there were no samples, prototype pieces, or really quality control of any kind before they were made in large enough quantities to equip the airborne unit and other forces selected to field test it. This lack of oversight was soon realized when wearers began to notice that after approximately 4 to 6 washes, the color of the design would fade tremendously, while the Velcro on the uniforms would lose their cling. Not only that, but basic use would result in the pattern quickly wearing off at the knees of the pants, and usage during sunny days would fade the colors as well. So, generally, these uniforms, or at least the way the camouflage was printed onto them, were greatly flawed. Despite this, the process to begin purchasing additional uniforms was put forth. However, by September, after further testing, the decision was made to not accept them. But only a few days later, an offer was accepted and signed for thousands of summer weight uniforms from various manufacturers. Testing on these were not done yet were certified, and when they reached warehouses around the country, random tests were conducted on lots from every production company, all of which ended up with the same problematic results. By spring 2016, an investigation was launched against the man in charge of originally testing these, Colonel Alexander Kostyunin, after a series of financial irregularities were noticed relating to his father-in-law, a retired driver, who during this time had purchased 2 non-residential properties and 7 apartments. As of 2018, it appears the investigation was ongoing, but it seems that not much had come from it apart from Kostyunin being demoted and eventually stepping down due to health reasons. However, things weren't done yet, as in May 2016, news hit that the Ministry of Defense was planning to sue Konstantin Lesnick as they were accusing him of patenting Varan, effectively stealing the design from them. When asked about it, Lesnick stated that Varan had been a pattern in development since 2013, as it was originally designed to be used in the highlands of Afghanistan. Starting the following year, it was made available on the commercial market. However, it was tweaked to effectively work within Ukraine starting around spring of 2015. Continuing, he said he did have a patent for Varan, a slightly different commercial variant, and not Varan ZSU, which was designed exclusively for the Ukrainian armed forces. He compared the situation to the US Army's adoption of Scorpion W2 versus the multicam pattern, of which it shares a similar origin and design, saying that though the two patterns appear very similar, they both are different ones under different copyrights. His final point was that all the Ministry of Defense had to do was to copyright their version to prevent any issues. So, what happened to Varan? Well, from an official standpoint, the uniforms the armed forces were stuck around for a while, being sporadically used. It was most often seen during National Day parades, with a 2018 one showcasing its final appearance, though documents as recent as 2020 still lists it alongside MM14 as an active pattern. Commercially, variants of the camouflage are available online through a number of suppliers, which sees shifts in color such as this one, which had a more green appearance overall. Likely due to all of these compounding issues, the armed forces ended up sticking with MM14, which essentially remained the standard issue camouflage. The last major development MM14 saw came in October 2016 when a blue version of the pattern was unveiled for naval personnel, which was given the name MM16. And that will about do it with the exhaustive events that inevitably led Ukraine to creating its own camouflage pattern for the 21st century. Now, this was a rather extensive look at Ukraine's camouflaging improvement endeavor. However, it's hard to know if other patterns were considered and/or designed. During the long period, other ones were fielded on a limited basis, but were usually one-offs. Whatever the case though, all of this shows that Ukraine was, from the start, in a very tough situation when trying to design and develop a new pattern, as it had to deal with issues relating to politics, economic and budget constraints and controversies, less than optimal infrastructure, and the constant back and forth between Europe and Russia. However, even though it was a long endeavor, the final result, MM14, seems to effectively symbolize Ukraine and its slow but steady movement towards bettering itself from the inside out. As of this video's publishing, the war in the East has not only escalated but broadened in scale, seeing Russian forces invade much of the country in what it calls a special military operation within Ukraine. As a result, most of Europe and many other countries all over the world have condemned these actions, placed sanctions on Russia, and provided weapons and supplies to Ukraine, which continues to fight. One of the most noticeable differences, however, now, compared to 8 years ago when the conflict started, is that most of the ground forces of Ukraine are far better equipped and much more uniform in appearance. Though other patterns can still be spotted supplementing MM14, at the end of the day the camouflaging endeavor was a success, and MM14 has proven to be a pretty effective pattern, all while giving Ukrainian troops a more professional, efficient, and perhaps most importantly, Ukrainian image. A very special thanks to Alexander from Poland for providing information on many of the patterns mentioned throughout. If you enjoyed the video, perhaps leave a like and make sure to subscribe. If not, no problem. Just be sure to check back soon for more videos right here on Uniform History.